Welcome to another exciting episode of Humanity 8.0, a podcast where we talk about our post-truth present and our transhuman future, with the aim of sketching out the outlines of what awaits us in the years and the decades ahead of us. This podcast is brought to you by Rokos. Companies with limited IT budgets and personnel can now get the same cybersecurity protection as big enterprises. Rokos' Secure Access Service Edge, SASE solution, with zero trust, provides enterprise-grade comprehensive cybersecurity so that you can focus on your business. For more, please visit www.rokos.com. That's ROQOS.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo.
But let me go back to the Transhumanist Party and ask you the following. My understanding is, or why don't you tell me like the bottom line mission? Do you guys do you exist to propagate the message mainly, or do you guys exist to have impact on the political sphere in terms of legislation, or maybe both, or if both, is there an emphasis on either one, or maybe more?
Well, ideally, our intention is to have impacts in both of those regards. As you can see behind me, our motto is putting science, health, and technology at the forefront of American politics. So how we do that can be quite multifaceted. One role, of course, is to be advocates of ideas, to inject ideas and principles into the conversation that would be neglected otherwise by the major political parties. Because honestly, in the United States, how often does one hear a Republican politician or a Democratic Party politician speak about the possibility of an emerging technology actually solving a problem that they claim to be concerned about? Quite the contrary, often I think these mainstream politicians wish to perpetuate these problems in order to have talking points, in order to be able to conveniently segment the population based on people's stances on these so-called wedge issues. So we would like to have a different tone in American politics, where instead of being focused on what divides us, we focus on what could actually solve these lingering issues in ways that would be positive sum, that would benefit everybody. And this is where a heavy focus on technology and science would come in. Now, in terms of influencing legislation, we did have a success in that area in 2019 in the state of Nevada, where we prevented an attempted ban on voluntary microchip implants. And we had quite a successful initiative where one of our supporters testified in front of the Nevada legislature, and she is a cyborg magician. Her name is Anastasia Sin, and she showed how some of these microchip implants actually worked and explained that they could not be used to effectively surveil people or make them do anything against their will. And I think there was this prevailing misconception among legislators about what these technologies were even capable of. So as a result of that educational process, that attempted prohibition did not move forward. And the bill was rewritten to be a lot more innocuous. So this is an example of the kind of influence that we can have. Do I expect that a lot of transhumanists will be elected to public office in the next few years? Probably not. But it doesn't hurt to run some candidates, especially at the local level. Our presidential candidate, of course, is primarily going to be a spokesperson for the ideas of transhumanism. But we've had local candidates for mayor or city council who can be quite effective at spreading these ideas within areas where people might not have been exposed to them. So our mayoral candidate in 2021, Jennifer Hughes, she ran for mayor of Camden, New Jersey, on an explicitly pro-life extension platform. And this was the first time, to our knowledge, that any mayoral candidate in the US spoke openly about the desirability of life extension. So setting those kinds of precedents is important for a longer term, because as with environmentalists, there is a certain diffusion of the ideas to the broader public and to the political sphere that is quite feasible. So in the 1960s and 1970s, I think many people still considered environmentalists to be somewhat radical, but now a lot of politicians from mainstream political parties will claim to be environmentalists. So I think we will have won a victory if in a decade or 2 decades, politicians from mainstream American parties or non-mainstream parties, so libertarians and Greens and socialists are welcome to call themselves transhumanists as well. But if they all acknowledge the validity of the ideas of transhumanism and do not hesitate in calling themselves transhumanists, whatever other affiliations they might have, then we will have transformed the culture in the direction that we would like. And whether our party in particular wins political office is not as important.
Okay. So let's do an exercise, right? Let's say, what was the name of, do you know the name of the person who ran for the Canton? Let's say that person had won.
Yes, Jennifer Hughes.
Okay, sorry. I think you said it and I didn't take it down. So let's say Jennifer Hughes had won and became mayor. What do you think, maybe 2 or 3 things that she would have done, somebody who is not running on that platform, right? Transhuman platform, who would have done? Somebody who wouldn't have done if it was not her. What would she have done? Like maybe, so she ran on longevity, right? What does that mean for the audience?
Yes. So she actually had several policy proposals along these lines that are quite intriguing. So one of them is a Center for Scientific Solutions that she would have founded in Camden, New Jersey, to essentially bring a lot of scientific innovation, a lot of research investment, a lot of private and nonprofit organizations into Camden. And one of her other initiatives was called Housing for All. Another of her initiatives was called Food for All. So she subsumed those under Healthy Life Extension initiatives, which was very interesting because Camden is not a financially affluent part of New Jersey. And as a result, she wanted to relate to a lot of the concerns of her constituents and saying that in addition to funding scientific research to reverse biological aging, we're also going to address food insecurity. We're also going to address housing insecurity. We're also going to make sure that Camden becomes an educational hub so that people can study these scientific disciplines and improve themselves and improve the productivity of the area. So she had some very interesting ideas. She actually canvassed a lot as a part of getting the necessary petition signatures to qualify for the ballot. And she did qualify for the ballot. As a part of that, she did what a lot of Democratic Party candidates would not have done in Camden, because Camden is dominated by the Democratic Party. They have ruled there for decades, and they don't feel like they need to really go out and relate to the typical voter in the same way. They think they have the elections essentially preordained in their favor. Yeah. So when Jennifer went out and she talked to people, she was actually asking them, well, what are your concerns? What could be done to enable you to live healthier, to have a higher standard of living, to enable you to care about scientific and technological advancements? Because I think that is important to consider. Why aren't there more transhumanists? I think too many people are still struggling day to day, especially in these turbulent pandemic era times that we live in. And as a result, they don't have the mental bandwidth to consider possibilities for a longer term future. So I think her approach was actually very clever, very relatable for many ordinary voters who had not been exposed to transhumanism yet. And I think her focus on the well-being of ordinary people, combined with this Center for Scientific Solutions and bringing in research institutions, bringing in various investments, could have really transformed Camden for the better. It's a shame that the Democratic Party still had such an overwhelming presence in Camden that they won that particular election. But this was the first time in decades that they had been challenged by any candidate outside of their party. So at least we made progress in kind of shattering that impression that the Democrats were people's only choice.
Yep. Okay. Wow. We have 5 minutes. Can we do 10 minutes?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, because I really want to delve into the next one. So you have a book that last time you flashed several times.
Yes.
I was totally happy with it that you had flashed the book. Do you have it near you that you wanna show the folks, and then we can talk about the topic that I want to talk about that I think is really interesting?
Yes, absolutely. Just a moment.
Okay. All right. So I can't read the title. Maybe you can read it for us.
Yes. So the title is Death is Wrong, and the cover image is a child essentially banishing the Grim Reaper. You can see the child is not happy about death being a part of reality. So the child is strongly asserting that death is wrong and it has no place in a just world. This was actually my view as a child. This was what initially brought me to transhumanism. And the book tells my story as a child when I found out about human mortality. I was a very curious child at the age of 4. I kept asking, well, what happens next? And what happens next in life? And then I was told, and then people die. And I asked, what is that? And I was told, well, people simply cease to exist. And I had this visceral aversion to that prospect, because how could it be someone who had done nothing wrong, who hasn't harmed people, just receives the ultimate penalty of non-existence? And to me, that was unacceptable. It has always been unacceptable. The difference between me and other children is that I did not fall for the commonly put forth rationalizations and excuses, in my view, for death. So I wanted to write a book that other children could relate to and could see that they're not alone, because I think many children, when they initially learn about death, have that reaction, but they don't have the support network to tell them that it's perfectly fine to think that way and you can do something about it. You can at least contribute to the solution to this greatest of all problems.
Okay, so what is the target audience? Like 7-year-old, somebody who can read, who's a kid?
I would say 8 and above for
8 and above?
most children. I've had a lot of success with teenagers reading this book. I think some precocious younger children would appreciate this book. I, at the age of 5, would have really appreciated this book. So I wrote the kind of book that I would have wanted to have as a child, but I realized for most kids, they would need to be a bit older to really engage with the concepts in the book. But that is fine as well. I think 8 or 9 would be early enough for this book to really have a formative influence.
Okay. So let's take a 9-year-old child who, and we've all had the experience of gradually becoming aware of this thing, and I don't think any child reacts to it in a positive way. So let's say that child is in that state of initial shock, perhaps, or anxiety, and they pick up the book. Walk me through how it would sort of calm them down and get them to be looking forward to instead of feeling paralyzed and this is the deal, and I just need to, do the best that I can for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 decades in front of me. How would the book, help them navigate in a way that you think is better than they would navigate their life, or at least that moment in the years after that, without the book?
Yes. So first of all, I think it would be important for them to get the understanding that they are not alone. And that is very important for a child to know that what they're thinking and what they're feeling is not just blatantly wrong, and it's not so unusual as to have no parallels somewhere else. If they come to understand it's entirely fine to react this way, then I think that would give them some comfort and some confidence. But more importantly, the book gives examples of longer lived animals and plants that have lifespans far in excess of human beings. And actually, when I update Death is Wrong, hopefully sometime next year, I'm going to include many more examples of long-lived creatures, since there has been a wealth of discovery with regard to animal longevity since 2013 when I wrote this book. The book also offers very easily digestible counters to common arguments in favor of human mortality, like the overpopulation argument or the boredom argument or the afterlife argument, just to give a few examples. And instead, it offers some possibilities for what could you do with all of that time? How would your life be different? What could you achieve? What could you attain? What could you explore? How much richer could your experience be? So that's the inspirational aspect of the book. That leads kids to think there is such a wonderful existence that is achievable if only we can overcome this great nemesis of death. And of course, I recognize, just as progress is not inevitable, and you and I agree on that, the victory in this particular quest is not inevitable. It requires certain quite impressive advancements in science and technology. So one key purpose of the book is to motivate kids to get involved in those fields, either as scientists and technologists themselves or as advocates in a role similar to what I'm engaged in. And we do, in the book, offer certain links, a brief outline of the SENS approach, Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence, which was pioneered by Dr. Aubrey de Grey. And essentially, the hope is this book is a gateway for young kids or older teenagers or even adults who are interested in these ideas to explore them further, to seek out the writings of Aubrey de Grey, for instance, or of Ray Kurzweil, or of some of the philosophers whom I cite in the book. And I cite historical thinkers as well. I cite Francis Bacon, Benjamin Franklin, the Marquis de Condorcet, Friedrich Nietzsche, Alan Harrington. All of them actually had a certain aversion to human mortality and at least had hopes that technology would overcome it. So I want to introduce kids to this world of ideas and scientific endeavors so that, yes, they would have more than enough to occupy 6 or 7 decades of their lives and then some. And then they would realize, oh, 6 or 7 decades, that's not nearly enough time. So why not try to get more time? Why not be a part of this great effort? So that is my goal. I hope that, especially as time passes, I'm going to start seeing kids who have grown up with this book, and I hope to hear from them how it has influenced the trajectories of their lives.
Okay. So as human beings, I think we have this thing about fearing death and so forth. That's innate in us and feels unnatural. I don't think it feels natural at any point in time, really, till perhaps towards the end. I don't know. Let's just say that's one of the things that we don't accept easily. I think the other thing that we don't accept easily, we don't comprehend, is the notion of infinity, right? We know that the universe will at some point collapse. It will end, right? And so one way or the other, we have to come to terms with finitude. right? So let's say instead of living 80 years, maybe we live for 400 years. But that's still, there's going to be an end at some point, right? Um, is your sort of like, point me to like the crux of what you're trying to do? Are you trying to just elongate the life of human beings, or are you trying to change the way we think about our life as something that is not, that doesn't have an end in and of itself? So that's one thing I wanted you to touch on, if it's clear enough. And second one is, do you think it's worthwhile to differentiate between, say, a natural death, somebody who is in their 30s, and what I would call, maybe you wouldn't call, a natural death, with somebody in their 90s, and they have done they've had a good life, they've raised a family, they've done the things that they wanted to do, and so it's their, let's say, time to go, right? So in my mind, I differentiate between those two, and I think most people do. I think most people will be totally aligned with you, like, do whatever it takes. Anybody who is in their 20s, do what it takes, use whatever technology to save them, cure the disease, enable them to, if they lose a leg, to have a leg, invest in that. That's beautiful, it's wonderful, let's do that. But then maybe the controversy starts to get into, so yeah, so do we become hedonistic, the boredom argument, right? So there's this thing that bothers me about infinitude, right? Infinite, right? That we are not naturally, that we're anxious about. And I don't know where you stand on that. Are you proposing the first one, and what happens to that tension between like being comfortable with finitude because we think finite, right? And then become very anxious when we start thinking about the universe. The question that my son asked me when he was a little boy is like, so okay, so what happened before it started, right? And then what happens after it ends, right? So you know what I'm saying? It's a basic
Yes.
question that we can't grasp in our head, right? And so now we're introducing this thing about living forever, if that's if my understanding. How do you deal with that? Are you introducing new anxiety there?
I don't think this would introduce new anxiety. First of all, there is a long way to go before we could be anywhere near indestructible. So even with radical life extension, we would still have vulnerable physical bodies. So our lives technically would not be immortal. They would be indefinite or open-ended. And the distinction is death would still be a possibility. It just wouldn't be an inevitability. So right now, no human has lived past Jeanne Calment's record of 122 years, and everyone except for her died before the age of 120, as far as we know. So 122 is perceived today as a kind of strict upper bound. We want to remove that strict upper bound as the first step and give people the optionality. So if some people don't want to pursue life-extending medical advances, we're not going to coerce them, but we will give them that choice. So incrementally, as we keep on living, we're still going to have to address threats to our health, diseases that arise, external threats, the possibility of accidents or natural disasters or planet-wide disasters that could endanger our well-being. And that is going to be a challenge for our species for many decades, centuries, millennia to come. Now, you mentioned the possible so-called end of the universe. I actually have a different view on this, and it's articulated in my video, Transhumanism and the Second Law of Thermodynamics, where I explain my understanding that really the posited heat death of the universe is a misrepresentation of the second law of thermodynamics that requires certain conditions to hold which do not necessarily hold, like the universe being a closed system, so to speak. But really, universe isn't a thing. It's not an entity. It doesn't have, in my view, a discrete singular beginning or end. Universe is simply a collective designation that people use for purposes of convenience to refer to everything that exists. So individual things and individual organisms have beginnings, Could they have an end? Absolutely, they could have an end, just as individual humans could have an end. Must they have an end? Can we conceive of a human who lives for 130 years? Can we conceive of a human who lives for 1,000 years? Can we conceive of a human who lives for 1,000,000 years? Can we conceive of a human who lives for 1,000,000,000 years? Yes, that would be a very different being from who we are right now. But could we conceive of a chain of continuous events to get us from here to billion-year-old humans who still identify to some extent with being us? Absolutely. So that billion-year-old human is not going to be infinity years old at that time. He or she or it is going to be 1,000,000,000 years old at the time. And there may still be challenges to overcome. There may still be threats to that person's existence. And at any given moment, there will be a finite set of capabilities and a finite focus that that person is capable of engaging in. It's just going to be a much broader set of capabilities and much greater ability to focus on a variety of aspects of existence, I would hope. So I don't think we ever get into the really paradoxical situation where something or someone is infinity years old, because you never get there even if you stay alive indefinitely. Now, on your question about whether there's a distinction between a natural death and an unnatural death, I will note that throughout much of human history, average life expectancy was in the 30s and sometimes even in the 20s. It actually only advanced beyond the 30s in the 19th century. So at the beginning, even of the 20th century, in every country in the Western world, life expectancy was lower than it is in every country in Africa today. And that's quite remarkable, because it resulted in a complete reorientation of people's perspectives as to what is a natural death. Prior to the revolution in the mid-19th century that was brought about by the germ theory of disease, sanitation, various other public health advances, most people would die of infectious disease. So what that meant was death from infectious disease was not considered as egregious as it would be today. So when a young person dies from COVID today, that is rightly seen as a great tragedy. Whereas if a young person died from typhus or cholera or tuberculosis in the 19th century, yes, people would have mourned that person, to be sure, but they would have seen that more as part of the everyday course of things. So our expectation as to what is a natural death is also going to evolve based on our level of technological advancement. So if an 80-year-old or a 90-year-old could be biologically youthful, and then there were some freak accident or some sort of disease condition that arose suddenly that endangered that person's life or took away that person's life, I think people would see it just as tragically as people see the death of a 30-year-old today. And it is all a matter of what that person is capable of accomplishing, what that person's quality of life would be were it not for that disease condition. I think when people say, oh, it was someone's time to go, they mean this person was suffering, this person was in pain, this person was in decline, and they wouldn't want that person to experience that for longer. Now, I actually have a different perspective on that. My view is life in any state is better than death. And I would support prolonging the lives of those individuals as well. But I can understand where that other perspective is coming from. But if 100 becomes the new 30, then I'm sure the deaths of 100-year-olds will be seen in a similarly tragic light.
Yeah, no. I mean, in my lifetime, at least from where I come, North Africa, somebody dies in their 60s was okay, they were old, right? I think now, even there, right, that the 60s, okay, they're that young, right? And I think soon it will be 70s. Probably it's already almost there, right? 70s, right? 72. You could have gotten another 10 years. I think right now it's 80s, 90s. And I totally can see where in 20 years might be, if you die before 100, it's it's an untimely death. Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question, okay? Again, death. So I think we agree that no matter what, like let's say we have let's say we have a gene therapy, it was a gene therapy, and we switched off the mortality gene, because I think death is actually a feature for the species, right? The species is going to, at least that's my theory, that's what I've been taught, right? And you may, you probably, don't agree with that. The species itself needs to rejuvenate itself, so the species that do have that in their gene, and they die, and you have new, maybe is better than other species. Let's just assume that for now, right? For the sake of the argument, right? You are saying that, hey, let's say we turn off that gene, or some kind of an innovation happens, now we can live for 300 years, and let's say we're all for that. Just say that we are, we find that to be a positive thing. You also said, and I think I heard you say that it doesn't mean that we are indestructible. We still have to watch out, right? Don't go in front of a bus, and don't drink cyanide and so forth, right? Because you die, right? Now, given the fact that now we have the danger of death still within amongst us, right? It's not gone anymore, right? But now we have this notion, and so we read your book when we're kids, and we see death as a thing to fight, and let's go and let's contribute, and so on and so forth. That becomes this thing that we're no longer preparing ourselves for, right? It becomes a thing that just happens unexpectedly, tragically, as opposed to now, which I think all our life it seems to me, we're sort of preparing ourselves to move on, right? It's part of our thinking, like we're always thinking about it. Not always, but it's part of our the way we live, right? Do you think that that kind of preparation, right, is no longer there, so that death becomes more of an anxiety giving thing when it happens? A family loses someone, it's a massive thing. People are not prepared for it. A lot of disruption, a lot of grief, because it's just a thing that's like a thunderbolt, right? I know you want it to be a thunderbolt. You don't want people to get used to it. But if it's going to happen, aren't we creating vulnerable folks, in terms of emotionally, like they'll be devastated by death, and if it happens around them, if they lose a friend or a brother or a sister, and it's just too much for them to take it, and they are unhappy for long. Maybe they get depressed. What do you think about the fact that if we see it as an enemy like that, we are not getting close to it, not understanding it, we're not preparing ourselves for it, and we are not ready for the shock when it happens?
Well, I do think there is value in having the public attitude shift from one of acceptance or preparation to one of shock, because what are shocking events? Shocking events are generally infrequent enough and unexpected enough that they're seen as quite remarkable and noteworthy when they occur. Hence, when you read headlines in newspapers, you don't read 40,000 Americans died in automobile accidents this year. You read about a mass shooting or a terrorist attack or some other freak cause of death for people where that cause of death was not expected. And the only reason why these events generate headlines is because they are comparatively quite rare. Now, of course, they shouldn't happen at all. And I think they are great tragedies and travesties when they do happen. But if death itself can become relegated to that kind of headline-making event, that would mean there would be so many more people who wouldn't die on a day-to-day basis. Right now, over 150,000 people die every day, and about 110,000 of them die due to causes related to biological aging. So if we could reduce that number to 5 people per day, and then the newspapers sensationalized their deaths because they were only 400 years old and they had so much potential and they contributed so much to the world, and now we're never going to have their minds, their contributions again. Perhaps that should outrage people. Right now it doesn't, when people die by the hundreds of thousands. As Stalin was rumored to have put it, the death of one person is a tragedy and the death of millions is a statistic. And I want death to cease being seen as a statistic. I want it to be seen as a tragedy on the individual level whenever we lose someone. And of course, right now it's difficult to see that from each of our standpoints because the problem is so overwhelming. So we focus on the people we know, we focus on the people we know of at the very least, as well as the people who fall victim to these sensational tragedies, which are quite rare. So I would say overall, we would be in a much better world if every death did make headline news and there were many fewer deaths, which is the only way that could be possible. But on your comment about programmed aging, essentially there is a theoretical debate, I would say, within the longevity research community as to whether or not aging is pre-programmed. So there is a school of thought that suggests essentially an evolutionary origin for aging. There's another school of thought, and Dr. Aubrey de Grey is an articulate advocate of that school of thought, where aging is accumulated damage. Essentially, after one has reproduced, there is no longer the same, let's say, evolutionary pressure to keep one alive. It's not that there's a gene that is triggered that causes one to age and die. It's that simply from the standpoint of the continuation of the species, it's irrelevant whether or not the individual survives. So essentially, damage continues to accumulate as a result of being alive in the first place through the consequences of metabolism. And essentially, the mechanisms that protected one in earlier life start to deteriorate, start to work increasingly poorly. And that is eventually what leads to the pathologies of disease in late life. And if we can just reverse that damage, then it wouldn't matter how recently or how long ago we were of reproductive age from a biological standpoint. Our bodies would still function just as well as they did before. It's just that evolution did not enable us to have those built-in repair mechanisms. It enabled some other species to have those built-in repair mechanisms, like tortoises, certain species of giant tortoises, Greenland sharks, naked mole rats, who live at least 30 years compared to various other species of mice and rats who only live a few years. So it's clear that it's not just a single genetic aging program that affects all species, at the very least. Some species do not have that kind of fate. So if a giant tortoise doesn't have to senesce in the same way, then why do we? That, I think, is an important insight to consider.
I think I read somewhere that some sort of a jellyfish they found is basically almost immortal or something.
Yes, it's called Turritopsis dohrnii. It's a jellyfish that can undergo a process called transdifferentiation, where it reverts back into its infant state, essentially, and it can undergo the cycle of growth and then reversion and then growth indefinitely. This is why it is known colloquially as the immortal jellyfish. And of course, in the wild, they can get eaten by larger predators. And this is why there's not just an overwhelming proliferation of them. However, if you leave them alone, if you don't eat them, they could potentially live an indefinite period of time.
So if I were to grab one and put it in an aquarium, it would survive me and a lot of other generations could come?
Yes, the challenge would be finding enough human caretakers to make sure that this jellyfish's needs are met.
Its upper limit is humanity, right? Wonderful. Okay, well, Gennady Stolyarov, thank you so much for the education. I think I continue to scratch the surface on this topic, to be honest with you. But if somebody wants to find out more about you, like the one place they would go to, and I'm gonna list a lot of the stuff that we talked about here, where would they go?
Well, several places. First of all, please go to the Transhumanist Party website at transhumanist-party.org. I also have an online magazine of my own, which I've been publishing for over 20 years now, called The Rational Argumentator, rationalargumentator.com. And I have a YouTube channel. It is G. Stolyarov II, so the first letter of my first name, then my last name, followed by 2 I's for the second. You can find my videos, including our weekly U.S. Transhumanist Party virtual enlightenment salons. You can find some of my commentaries. You can find even some of my musical compositions there, and I'm releasing more later this year. So you can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search for my name there. I post regularly, and I look forward to getting in contact with each of your viewers, Ahmed, who are interested in transhumanism and interested in my work.
Wonderful. Gennady Stolyarov, thank you so much for making the time. I appreciate it. This will be aired probably in a couple of weeks. I'll give you a heads up when it comes out. I'll make sure that I'll contact you via email to get all the websites and the social media handles. But thank you again.
Yes, thank you, Ahmed. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
You've been listening to Humanity 8.0 with your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo. Brought to you by Rokos. Thanks for listening.